Did you forget about these NBA players? When I say forgotten about, of course, they're still in the league, people still know who they are, but compared to how they were talked about maybe a couple years ago, or last year, or 3 years ago, these are some forgotten NBA players. And number one is none other than Jordan Poole. Of course, we know a couple years ago on the Warriors, it was a pool party every night. And Jordan Poole not only was talked about a bunch, he may have been like one of the most talked about NBA players that season. I'm talking about 2022. He was also talked about in 2023, but like it was, a crazy season for different reasons. But in 2022, there were Jordan Poole memes every single night. Like you heard him left and right talked about with his highlights, with his handles, with the baddies on the court. You couldn't scroll on social media without seeing something related to Jordan Poole. Seriously. And now in 2024, he has become forgotten about. Like I said, everybody still knows who Jordan Poole is, and there were still some memes made about him last year, but the comparison from when he was on the Warriors to now, it's like so quiet. Like how many people do you hear talking about Jordan Poole now? Not too many. And I'm not saying this in a bad way or a good way. I'm just saying like, these are some players who just have gotten forgotten about, unfortunately. So I'm shedding some light on them, so now we can remember them. Number 2 is Gary Harris. I feel like on this list, he may be one of the most forgotten about NBA players. When was the last time you heard Gary Harris's name? Or you saw a highlight from him? Like, he has become so forgotten about, especially going from Denver, where he was the original big three with them. And let me use that term lightly because they were not a big three at the time, but they were supposed to be. Like, if you remember, it was supposed to be Jokic, Jamal Murray, and Gary Harris. He was literally supposed to be a part of a championship core. Like, that was the hype around the three of them together. And since then, obviously, he hasn't really, been talked about much. And in fairness, he's had a lot of injuries. And even last year, I believe he had, he was injured for, part of the season. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think he was there for a lot of the season. I know he did play at some point, and obviously you see him in the Magic jersey here, but he has just become completely forgotten about. Number 3 is THT, Talen Horton Tucker. When THT was on the Lakers, it was all THT all day. You heard so many things about him. So many people were hyping him up. So many of his highlights were everywhere. Like, it was a media fest for THT. And ever since he left the Lakers, there has been barely any coverage on him. There was a couple of dunks. He had like some really nice dunks last year that did get some coverage. But generally speaking, his media coverage has completely fallen off. And now he's even on the Chicago Bulls. How many of you knew that? It's to the point where a lot of people probably wouldn't even know that he's on the Bulls. He's not even on the Jazz anymore. So let's shout out THT, like I said, shouting out all these players so we can remember them. Next we have Robert Williams. In fairness to Robert Williams, he had a big knee injury, I believe, last year. So I don't know if he played more than 10 games last year with the Blazers. So because he was not on the court, obviously that's a big reason nobody was talking about him. But to go from the Celtics literally 1 year removed. Like, for THT, he hasn't been on the Lakers for like 3 years maybe. Robert Williams was literally on the Celtics in 2023, and his media coverage completely fell off as soon as he left the Celtics. Like, it's insane to me because he was being hyped, and it's not even hyped because he actually is that good when he's healthy. Like, he was that good as a center on the Celtics. Everything he brings as a center is so important to any team. However, the whole point of this is you all, I won't say you all, but a lot of you probably forgot Robert Williams is on the Blazers now because we haven't heard anything. Next we have Rashad Holmes. Rashad Holmes is now a teammate of Jordan Poole's on the Wizards. And it was like, I guess 5 seasons ago at this point, maybe less, more or so less, that he was on the Kings and he was playing very well and he was getting some media coverage, and no one declared him the best center in the NBA. I'm not saying that at all. But you saw how much potential and how well he was playing, and he was getting talked about like he could be a quality center on a lot of teams. And ever since he's been on the Kings, there hasn't been much talked about him. And he's been pretty bounced around. I believe he was on the Mavs, and obviously on the Wizards, like I said. He was a couple other places too. I can't remember, but did he have 2 stints with the Kings? I don't know about that, but Rashad Holmes, welcome back. Seth Curry, I mean, he is Steph Curry's brother, but how many of you remembered that Seth Curry is still in the league and he is on the Charlotte Hornets? Seth Curry has been on a bunch of teams in the NBA, and he was actually a quality player on a bunch of the teams he was on. Like, he went to the Mavericks like 3 times, and I'm not exaggerating. I believe he had 3 stints with the Dallas Mavericks. And now that he's on Charlotte, of course, they're not a playoff team, so they're not going to get as much media coverage in general, which also can be said about partially why some of these players are not getting as much media coverage, because Rashad Holmes, for example, is on the Wizards, and Horton Tucker was on the Jazz, and so none of those teams were playoff teams. But Seth Curry, similar to what I said about Gary Harris, when was the last time you heard someone say, here's a Seth Curry highlight? It's like crazy. We forgot about him. How about Shake Milton? Let's talk about him. When he was on the Sixers, maybe like 3 seasons ago, it was all Shake Milton. Like, there was a stretch where he was a consistent, maybe even starter on the Sixers. I'm trying to remember if he was starting all those games. I think he was. And he was dropping points left and right. Like, he was playing very well. And he was consistently in the rotation, and then all of a sudden, he fell out of the rotation. And that's partly because they got Harden, and then Maxey started playing really well. And they just became crowded at the point guard position. But like, a few years ago, Shake Milton was shaking people up on the court. And then he went to the Knicks, as you see in this photo. He didn't really play for them. And now he's on the Brooklyn Nets, where I feel like he should get some playing time because they are a rebuilding team. But maybe we'll remember Shake Milton now because he's back on the Nets. And the last player is Josh Richardson. He is another player who has been on multiple teams. He is back with Miami. Well, he rejoined them last year, I think. And so this is his 2nd time with Miami because he was drafted by them. But he was on the Spurs. He was on the Celtics. He was on another team. But it's really going to bother me because I know he was somewhere else. And I just really can't remember what team it was. But now he's back with the Miami Heat. And he was actually, if I remember correctly, a lottery pick. Like, he was the 6th pick, or was he the 9th pick? Did I make that up? He was definitely a 1st-round pick. Maybe he was like the 16th pick. I'm trying to remember. He was a 1st-round pick, though. And there was a lot of hype around him, especially around his defensive abilities. And they really thought it could have been the future in Miami with him and Justice Winslow. Like, do you remember that time? Him and Justice Winslow were like the future of the Miami Heat. And since then, like I said, he's been on multiple teams. And I think he was on the Mavericks. That may have been the other team. I'll have to look it up after. And so now it's gotten to the point where by his age standards, I think he's like 30, so he should still be in his prime, but yet he has no media coverage anymore as well. So shout out Josh Richardson and shout out to all these players because they are still in the NBA and they could still add value to all these teams. So shout out to them.